We were all about 19 or 20 at the time, so yeah, 60 years is a long time. 10 years ago was the last time I spoke at this event at Sydney University up the road, and I spoke with two other of the bus riders as well. One of them was Alan Alfred, and Alan said to me before we went on stage, "It's terrible, I'm deaf, I won't be able to hear anything that anybody says." In which Gary Williams was another one, he was the third speaker at the meeting. He said to me, he said, "What am I going to say? I don't remember anything." He got on the bus. So, as I said then, I could actually say anything because Alan can't hear me and Gary can't remember. So, but I'll try and be as accurate and as pithy as I can be tonight. I just got to make half a dozen points, I suppose, which may well be well known to you, but I'm sorry about that. First thing is, it was the Americans. The young people and students, the youth radicalisation of the 60s began with the civil rights movement in the United States. We were incredibly inspired by black and white American students sitting in at lunch counters in the South, trying to desegregate bus stations, universities, schools, enrolling people to vote and so on. It was that movement against segregation and for integration in the deep South of the United States that woke up Australian students, I think it's fair to say, from the early 1960s onwards. And that frame, in a way, was both inspiring and in a way limiting for us, and I'll come back to that because I think it's an important point. And of course, the immediate prompt to do the bus tour was a huge demonstration downtown in May of 1964 when 2,000 students turned up to protest in favour of civil rights in the United States outside the US consulate. And the ALP Club, which was basically a conglomeration of anarcho-Trotskyists of various kinds, had organised this demo, and we were staggered at the huge turnout. And it was one of the most dramatic things was somebody had decided to bring a wooden timber cross packed with cotton wool soaked in petrol and lit it outside the doors of the US consulate. I mean, it was the Ku Klux Klan sign, but I don't know what. Anyhow, the coppers arrived from all over the city and waded in, and 29 people were arrested. But it went all around the world. But what it gave rise to, of course, was the obvious question. Here we were protesting for the rights of blacks in the United States. What about here? What was happening in Australia? And so the demo was followed very quickly by a mass meeting at Sydney University in the setting up of student action for Aborigines on the campus, on Sydney campus. It didn't take in any of the other universities. Sydney at that time prided itself on being the epicentre of the world revolution as far as Australia was concerned. So it wasn't quite a surprise that it happened there. And of course, the idea was to have a bus. And there were three quite obvious aims for this bus trip. We weren't going to the deep south, we were going to the deep north of New South Wales. We were going to go there to expose the grim living conditions of First Nations and Aboriginal people at that time, to do what we could to break down any colour bars or segregation, and finally to encourage as much as we can and support actual grassroots First Nations action that was starting to emerge in New South Wales at the time in lots of these country towns. And there were two main committees of student action for Aborigine. One of them specialised in contacting groups and sympathetic individuals all over New South Wales who might be able to help us and put us up during the bus trip and give us some support and put us in contact with local communities. And the other one actually organised the bus and recruited people and so on and raised funds. The bus did not arrive at these towns in February of 1965 as a bolt out of the blue. People, especially First Nations communities, knew we were coming. So the bus kicked off at midnight, and the 17th of February. Because it was an unholy hour, midnight, I missed the bus. But the next day I managed to get on the Northwestern Mail, which must have been the slowest train in the world, and inched my way, and I got to Walgett by the Monday, just in time to ticket the RSL club, which didn't admit returned First Nations soldiers or veterans at that time, and to jump on the bus that night when we got run off the road by a redneck-driven truck, and were saved from any further harm by a posse of the local First Nations youth who'd been following us out of town. So I arrived in a way at the most dramatic moment, or probably the most dramatic moment. I mean, there are other dramatic moments, like at Moree, where there was big clashes over desegregating the swimming pool in Moree. And I just say at this point, wherever we went, we stopped about a dozen communities in this bus trip, and 8 or 9 days we were on the road. Wherever we went, we got incredibly enthusiastic support from First Nations communities all along the road. They were with us 100%. When we went to picket somewhere, they came with us. When we needed to relax, they played basketball with us in Walgett. We lost, they won. Black boys jumped better than white boys. And so we, and even in a small place like Bowraville, up near Kempsey, when we were picketing the cinema, and some of the whites turned up and said, "Oh, you're just making trouble, we never had trouble here before." In this cinema, there was literally a boxed area at the front, 3 rows with a fence around it, where First Nations people were allowed to watch the movies. That was the kind of town it was. And so we were charged with making trouble and so on. And a 16-year-old girl who was slighter than about Geordie size, stepped forward between us and the white racists and announced what her name was, said she'd tried to get into the main part of the cinema the week before with her aunt, had been refused admission, and was now organising successfully a boycott of the cinema by the local First Nations people. We came across people, not only just First Nations people like this, but even the odd white radical. In a place like Moree, for instance, there was a bloke called Bob Brown, not the Bob Brown, but another Bob Brown, who ran an electrical goods store in Moree and had been elected to council in 1959, Moree councillor to Bet. But he was one of those kind of autodidacts, and it followed what's happening in the United States with the move to desegregate and integrate in the United States. And he decided to put up a resolution at the council meeting in November of 1961 to drop the colour bar at the Moree swimming pool, the council swimming pool. He didn't get a seconder, so on, but he was there again in 65 alongside us and helping us make contact with the First Nations communities in Moree and turning up and confronting the racists. So there was plenty starting to emerge on the ground, and that for me was the most heartening part of it, that we weren't coming as saviours or substitutionists or whatever in any way whatsoever. We were beginning to link with an emerging movement. I'll try and probably finish on this, is that there was, I mentioned this at the beginning, the American movement left its mark on us. We were very much agitating in a liberal social democratic frame. We wanted First Nations people, First Nations citizens to integrate with the predominant society in Australia. Their conditions to be improved, their rights to be improved, to have equality across the board with Australia. There was nothing wrong with that, but it was quite limited in its way that it was like that. It wasn't until the end of 1966 when the Gurindji at Wave Hill, stockmen, went on strike. They went on strike for equal pay, but it evolved into a land rights claim over the years that followed. But Dexter Daniels and Captain Major, as he was called, 2 of the leaders of the stockmen, came to Sydney University. We organised a meeting and fundraising and so on. And I can remember chairing the meeting and meeting them at the front steps and bringing them to the front lawn when we had meetings in those days. And they were talking in a foreign language. And I was so, like we all were, 1920 and so on, so wet behind the ears that we still do not realise that First Nations people had a culture and language of their own, and that they were an internal colony, and that the framework of a colonised people and a settler society still hadn't occurred to us, or only was slowly occurring to us. But, you know, the bus ride, while it was in that framework of against segregation, and it wasn't until the years that followed that we started to learn about the First Nations positions, our history, the idea of treaty, of land rights, that we had to respect the fact that there was another culture and other peoples here before we actually came. I mean, and that was the big eye-opener for us in the 60s. The bus ride was terrific. It raised the issue. It encouraged self-organisation, community organisation on the ground. But we still hadn't broken out of the liberal or the American social democratic framework. But that was happening. And that for me, what followed the bus trip was a very, very important thing. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us and sharing that epic story. Now I'll hand over to Paul to give his talk.
Hey, g'day everyone. My name's Paul Silva, a proud Dunghutti Aboriginal man from Kempsey, New South Wales. So I just want to start off with the Freedom Ride. As Hall mentioned, obviously travelling around to, a numerous amount of Aboriginal communities, and I want to touch on how Hall had explained our First Nations people was very, you would say, happy for the presence, very excited that they had white people on their side to expose the real issues within community. The segregation didn't just stop with, as Hall mentioned, putting children in segregation whilst they watched a movie. Not allowing them into pools and facilities. For a bit of background of the Dunghutti community, which is known as Kempsey, New South Wales, our people were segregated on a numerous amount of missions. One of them being Burnt Bridge Mission, where my family is originally from, and had congregated for many years prior to colonisation. And they wasn't able to leave those missions and those lands unless they had a ticket of authority to go into town, to go on their natural lands that was taken over by the settlers. And without that ticket, unfortunately, they would end up unalive. They would end up brutalised and, quite frankly, go missing. So then it moved on to, obviously the Freedom Ride, coming into communities, and, quite frankly, the participation within the Kempsey community did not only see access to the pools for First Nations people, but it's seen access to shops, it's seen access to housing, and it's seen more opportunities for First Nations people, because the reality of it is, yes, First Nations people was speaking up, but when we speak up as a group of Aboriginal people, do you hear them over there? Do you see them? No. We came here to take over, we don't listen to their issues. But when non-Indigenous people, white people, got sick of the issues that was implemented, they decided that enough was enough. And the reality of it is, it allowed access to, a number of sporting events. It's been advertised many years after the Freedom Ride went to Kempsey that Kempsey was in the top 10 categories of the number one racist towns within New South Wales. They actually did an experiment on one of the ABC outlets where a First Nations person actually visited a private rental company and asked would they have any vacancies. They said no. They then went back in with a non-Indigenous person, a white person. They offered him 3 different houses. The camera crew went in and said, why wouldn't you give it to him? Because the response was utterly and completely disgusting. The response from the landlord owner, or whoever it was, the coloniser, was, them people, they cannot afford it. It's what they're like. They don't look after stuff. despite the fact that they've built these houses, these facilities on the stolen land that they colonised. The Dunghutti community was one of our communities, one of our tribes, the first ever get native title out at Crescent Head, a beautiful beachland back in the 1970s. In New South Wales, the first ever native title, the first ever tribe to negotiate with governments, the agencies, to say that this is our land and we want full control and custodians, not just over our mass grave sites, but over our lands first and foremost. And we can keep moving on to, the systematic issues and the racism within communities, whether it be from the government, whether it be from agencies, whether it be from people within society. For me, growing up in Kempsey, New South Wales, like any other small community towns, it is predominantly made up of white people and Aboriginal people. Now, you do have the occasional Asian families, Indian families, but quite frankly, they don't even know each other or congregate with each other. So it's a quite divided and diversive community. And you see that in the media. They use that as a statistic. They will target the predominantly Aboriginal communities and say, oh, look at the crime statistics in this community. What do you mean, look at the statistics? The community is made up of all Aboriginal people, you dopes. With my activism and after being exposed to the death of my uncle, I took on a number of stuff that was out there. That was a big elephant in the room that we can probably see now, but I know that most of us in our life wouldn't have. Unfortunately, you have to get that trigger to see it, and it cost the life of my uncle to do so. But when you're incited on the systematic racism that not only takes place within community, within organisations, but it does really affect you. So for myself, being Aboriginal, being a person of dark skin colour, many can relate to it. You'll be stopped while driving while black. You'll have numerous times, for example, me and my family in Kempsey, New South Wales, back on the example of Aboriginal people can't get a house in those communities. Me, my partner and my 2 children had lived in a motel for approximately 6 months. The motel had 1 queen bed, a bathroom and a jug. This was due to no houses being available. No, it wasn't. It was due to, if you didn't work a fucking 9 to 5 job and you didn't make over $3,000 a week, you was never ever getting the property. And the only people in those communities that get those type of jobs are white people. So therefore the Aboriginal people don't get it. The homelessness that our people face within society is at an all-time high. Aboriginal deaths in custody, it's at an all-time high. A number of issues that over the years, over the generations, 237 years ago when these colonisers come here, we start off with the stolen generation, in the 1880s, and our community, the Dunghutti community, was really hit by that. The stolen generation, many of you know of the Kinchela Boys Home, most recently I wouldn't say celebrating, but participating in the anniversary of the 100th year anniversary of their people, our people being taken, being massacred and being murdered at the hands of these people. And only quite recently, that's not been in mainstream media, they've found mass grave sites at that facility of our people. They've found bones, they've found skulls of babies that have been killed and brutalised by these people. And we move on to the protection and assimilation policies, forced wage theft in the 1990s and 1970s, the Northern Territory intervention, 2007, the cardless debit cards, death in custody over policing. The 2023 referendum was built off racism. It was only put in implement, the short communication. And the current issues and resistance, the negotiations with treaty, land rights, native title, justice system and the reforms that First Nations people need in this country. Quite frankly, I've been, calling out these issues for the past decade now, and unfortunately what we see is it fall on deaf ears and blind eyes. And, the reality of it is we must stand as one and really push out the people that are affecting us, and that people is the government. The corruption that they present. Now, I've always said this and I will forever say it. They are not just targeting Aboriginal people. Yes, we're up here, they are targeting us. But the everyday citizens underneath of us are being targeted at an all-time high as well. The way that it is, if you're not brainwashed by the system, if you don't believe that you benefit in the system, if you don't believe that the system is for you, the system is against you. This system is put in a simulation to make us, human beings, be their modern day slaves. You know, the high rate and high cost of living. And within saying that, First Nations people should be rich within our own country. We should have our own lands back. Statistically, Aboriginal children being taken from their families is at an all-time high. Yes, it is a case-to-case basis, but, you know, what I will say is that the colour of their skin plays a big part within this system. You know, for me, myself, I come into contact with police and government agencies on a daily basis. You know, whether that be going about my everyday business, being pulled over while black, being stopped and searched while walking while black. You know, they're implementing these new laws, and the organisations, WA Police, have recently recognised that there are systematic failures and that the laws are being used to target First Nations people, Indigenous people, but yet they still allow these laws to be implemented. Unfortunately, the system doesn't want to listen to First Nations people. They don't want to work with us. You know, and I've always been a firm believer of abolishing the government and return it to the First Nations people. It may be... Some people say that, it's a fairy tale, you're in dreamland. Well, the reality of it is the government hasn't helped, nor has it been successful in stopping the issues here within Australia, but yet they would, you know, encourage and put money and financial support into governments that will then go and unalive other Indigenous people of their lands. You know, this is one of the prime examples of what they really stand for, and the corruption is at an all-time high. Like, when is enough enough? You know, like, at the end of the day, it's out there more than ever. You know, the systematic issues and the racism within communities, and quite frankly, what I don't understand is it's one thing for systems to say that they recognise the systematic issues, the systematic racism, but no one is being punished and held accountable. There is no actual action. Unless the person is black, they throw the book. They take the immediate action. And what I mean by that, if you're black within a government position, you step out of line, you're out the door. If you're white within a government position, come in here, mate, and we'll talk to you, and we'll just tell you don't do it again. You know, so being black in our own country is really hard as First Nations people, and for myself, quite frankly, with the work that I do, waking up to numerous messages saying you're a petrol sniffer, you're a CON, you don't deserve to live, you're an oxygen thief. It's quite disgusting that people would be taught that within society, because you're not born racist, you're actually taught it from your parents, your guardians, your siblings, or whoever may you've been growing up with. And, you know, it is a hard life still for First Nations people. It is very much still a hard life. You know, the racism can be very minimal, but yet it can cost a life. And we've seen that with deaths in custody. And not just deaths in custody, you know, we've seen that with the justice health system, whether it be doctors and nurses neglecting patients because they're black, just because they think that they're the next junkie that wants another shot. You know, and these statistics have resulted in death of human beings. You know, a prime example was a young Indigenous man presenting to the hospital out at Dubbo, New South Wales. I think it was 3 times in the one day. They refused him any treatment, sent him home. He had something explode inside his stomach, and unfortunately he was unalived. He passed away from systematic failures and healthcare negligence, that people haven't been held accountable. This is a prime example of what we face on a daily basis. And what I do say is we need to stand up. We need to make a stand, and we need to make change. Whether it be seeing an Indigenous person being called an abo down the street, just stop and say, hey mate, that's not nice, you shouldn't say that. You know, whether it's being Aboriginal people being stopped by police and targeted, just stop and start filming. Because the presence of non-Indigenous Australia in circumstances when it involves Aboriginal Australia, when the presence is there, they act different. They take the whole process different. And that's a prime example of how it is in today's day and age. Because back then in the day when there was no cameras, when there was no Mr. Hall standing with us, calling out the issues, they didn't care. That's why we was massacred. That's why we was unalive, because they thought that every white person agreed with their cruel and corrupt system. They thought that every white person was sick-minded like them. But it's not really like that. And you know, the Freedom Ride has made that a prime example. That not all people grow up on racism. Not all people see it for the way that they want to see it. You know, and that's what we need, is more people to disagree with their system, disagree with their government, and I believe that we could come one and abolish the system and live a better life all together, because the system's a problem. Thank you.
Brother.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that. It's absolutely right. We have to stand up and fight back, and part of that is you coming and speaking here, and it's incredibly important to have you here. So we'll pass over to Paddy now.
Thanks, comrade. Thanks very much for speakers coming to talk tonight. So my name's Paddy. I've been active in Aboriginal rights movement for many years now. Really proud to have stood alongside Paul during the big Black Lives Matter protests, 2020, 2021. But before that, and it's really interesting hearing Hall talk about the Freedom Ride experience in New South Wales coming out of students looking at America, and there being all this press about the civil rights movement in America and people getting excited about it and getting active and then thinking, oh shit, we've got this massive problem with racism here. What are we going to do about justice for Aboriginal people? Well, we had a very similar experience during Black Lives Matter. I mean, Paul and I were standing at demonstrations for his uncle David Dungay Jr., who was murdered in a Long Bay prison. We had 40 people, 50 people, outside the corrections office, in the wake of that murder, trying to get justice, trying to get some attention. And then suddenly, when George Floyd was killed and there was an uprising in the United States, and it was centre stage in terms of social media and news about black justice, we had 40,000 people at Town Hall Square, with the Dungay family actually leading those demonstrations, to say the system in Australia is no less viciously racist, and in many ways is more viciously racist than what we actually see in the United States, and we've got a responsibility to stand up and do something about it here. And it took a lot of courage that day. That demonstration was banned. The police said that we weren't allowed to actually come out and demonstrate, and this family led 40,000 plus people in a defiant demonstration, on those streets. And I think it was one of the biggest moments in Aboriginal rights history, actually. And it's an important moment, and we've got to look at how we can actually rebuild some of that power. And I said, the racism here is even more vicious than the United States. That's statistically true. The rate of incarceration of black people in Australia is the highest of any group of people on the face of the planet, right? The most incarcerated minority group on the planet is Aboriginal people in Australia. And I think you can't understand that without understanding the intensity of anti-Aboriginal racism that this system relies on. Like, we're socialists, we're a revolutionary socialist group. We're for the overthrow of the capitalist system. We see that it only benefits a tiny minority of people, the capitalist class, who have billions of dollars and run our world, and so they can make billions more. That's the only thing they care about. That's the only thing they actually allow society to do, is to produce things that are going to make more money for them, and regardless what their concerns are for the consequences. Here in Australia, that has required the genocide of Indigenous people to seize these lands. And that has required an ongoing, vicious anti-Aboriginal racism to justify their entire establishment, which exists on stolen lands. So we have this racism right at the core of capitalism here. And just with the remarks that the time I've got left, I do just want to talk a little bit about history, because I work as a historian, and I've actually done quite a lot of research in recent years about the period that Hall's talking about the 1960s in Australia, and about the struggle. And I think we can learn a lot from those times, to actually learn those lessons and think about how did people make change before can really inform how can we organise today. And I think one of the points that Hall made is really important, that the freedom rides didn't come as a bolt out of the blue, right? Like, those students didn't just go off in a bus out of nowhere and go to places where no one wasn't already active. They were acting in a moment. A lot of them actually weren't that conscious of it at the time, but they were acting in a moment where there had been a rich re-emergence of Aboriginal rights struggle. There was a real wave of struggle that emerged across Australia from the late 1950s. Right, when there was actually established a national organisation, the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement, what became FCATSI. And here in New South Wales, in Sydney, you had the formation of what was called the Australian Aboriginal Fellowship, which was both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal activists in the late 1950s that got together and said, how are we going to, their number one task was, get rid of the Aborigines Protection Acts, which are actually viciously controlling Aboriginal life. It was a system of apartheid, and they called it a system of apartheid. They said, we've got apartheid in South Africa, we've got apartheid in Australia. What did the Aborigines Protection Act mean? It meant that, as Paul said, if you were black, you could be ordered to live on a reserve. right? And you had to respond to the dictates of the manager on that reserve. If that manager wanted to tell an employer not to pay you wages but to pay the manager of the reserve, they had to do that, right? That was the actual power under the Aboriginal Protection Act. They could take children away with impunity, right? Aboriginal people weren't allowed alcohol, and police could go into any house any time of the day or night on the pretext of searching for alcohol, and they did, as a way of actually terrorising communities. So people were living under this intense segregation on the margins of society, enforced by this act. They said, how are we going to defeat this act? But I think very important for the growth of that movement was the fact that activists at the core of the movement saw the fight as a working class struggle. Right? They said, and the Communist Party was very important for this actually at the time. It could be quite critical of the Communist Party in many ways, but actually the activists then were very crucial in terms of saying this is an issue for all workers. Right? As Paul said, this system doesn't work for white people either, who aren't filthy rich. Right? We're oppressed as well. Okay? And the way that Aboriginal people are being treated is actually a way that they maintain power over all of us. It's the way that they divide us. It's a way that they make the ordinary poor white people think, oh, I'm superior and I've got something in common with Gina Reinhardt or some billionaire because we're white and superior and not like those blacks on the mission, when really actually they're getting exploited too. Right? So it was a way that the ruling class maintained power over everyone, was to have this particular system. And they saw that explicitly and they argued that, black and white. Right? And most of the Aboriginal activists who were active at that time in the movement were also trade unionists. Trade unions were far stronger in Australia in the early 1960s than they are now. More than half the workforce was in a trade union, right? And so a lot of these Aboriginal activists that had somehow managed to get off the reserve were living here in Sydney. There's a man whose biography I've just helped to write. We've just finished it. I'm looking forward to being able to share these stories more. His name was Ray Peckham. He came from a reserve in Dubbo. He grew up there. He moved to Sydney and he joined the Builders Labourers Federation and he joined the Communist Party. And the thing that he did to campaign against the Aborigines Protection Acts was with his union, the Builders Labourers Federation, which in the early 60s was now led by left-wingers, by socialists in the Labor Party and by communists. They systematically went around to all of the building sites all over Sydney, all down the south coast, all up into Newcastle, and they explained these issues to the workers on their lunch break. Right? They said, we need to oppose the Aborigines Protection Act. And they'd take resolutions, yes, we oppose the Protection Act. We call for the government to abolish this act. They'd give donations, and so Ray would have money that he could travel around to all the reserves around New South Wales, organising the communities and getting them together and saying that we can actually fight this system. And one of the places where that was done was in Walgett. Right? Ray had been to Walgett. There was a number of Aboriginal builders labourers actually at the time. Monty Maloney, another man, Alan Woods, a lot of Kooris who were living in the city and were working on building sites and were in the union and were with communists and socialists who said, like Paul had mentioned, this is a colonial question in Australia. That we're against the Vietnam War. We're for the revolutions that are happening in Africa of colonised people rising up. We've also got a question here in Australia of people actually demanding freedom and self-determination, right? And they recognised that and they argued that and they said that it's the responsibility of militant white workers to stand with the oppressed Aboriginal people and demand self-determination and freedom, right? It was a conscious argument that was made to the working class on their lunch break. You need to stand with black people and this is going to benefit us all and this is going to strengthen our movement. And that was the way that it was done, was that kind of systematic work actually going around. And so they managed, I just want to tell one story about the South Coast. On the South Coast, right, there was an Aboriginal Advancement League. That the South Coast Trades and Labour Council was an affiliate to this Australian Aboriginal Fellowship that I told you about, right? They were paying money so the fellowship could actually operate. Now, in the South Coast, there was a little Aboriginal community called Kumadichi in Port Kembla, which is a big steelworks at Port Kembla where they export things out. And a number of the Aboriginal people that lived on that little reserve worked on the port. Right, so they went to their work at the port. They had white workmates on the port. They were all in the union. The council, the Wollongong Council said in 1960, we're going to get rid of the Kumadichi Reserve. Get rid of it. We want to, get these blacks out of the way. We want to expand real estate. Right, and the local people that lived on that reserve went to their workmates and they said, we want to fight this. And they won support and they resolved, we're going to fight this. And they had delegations and protests where they said we'd fight this. And the council workers union said, well, we're not going to knock down their shacks on the reserve, right? We're going to stand with the people that are actually here. And they formed what was called an Aborigines Advancement League, and they managed to fight and win some permanent housing there at Kumadichi. And then they also commissioned a survey of Aboriginal working conditions all the way down the south coast. And Ray Peckham was someone who did that. Joe Howe, who was a white wharfie, did that. It was all communists who did all this stuff, right? And they travelled around all down the south coast and they surveyed the living and working conditions in 1962, and they were shocking. Right, we're talking about kids being forced to work, Aboriginal kids being forced to work, picking peas and beans, living in shanty towns on the outskirts of the picking area, denied medical treatment, denied jobs in town. Right, they brought this back to the South Coast Trades and Labour Council. I said, we've got to fight this. And again, they went out to all the workplaces and took resolutions, we want to fight this. And they set up an Aboriginal Advancement League in Nowra. And there was segregation in Nowra, right, where they wouldn't let people into the shops, etc. The Labor Council said, we will not deliver any supplies to any shop that refuses entry to Aboriginal workers. 1963, they beat segregation in Nowra, actually using the power of organised workers to do that. Right? It was also at this time they managed to win changes to the Aborigines Protection Act. So the Labor Council of New South Wales held big meetings and rallies to say we want to change the actual Aborigines Protection Act, and they won. Well, they said we want to abolish it, but they won key changes and they got rid of a lot of the powers, including that power about Aboriginal people not being allowed to have alcohol. But of course, some racist pubs wouldn't let Aboriginal people in anyway. So the Liquor Trades Union here in Sydney put bans on deliveries of liquor to a number of pubs that were refusing to actually serve Aboriginal people. This also happened down the south coast. So you could see this sort of working class movement and working class power was actually being used to fight racism. And this actually started to move up into the northwest. So the year before the Freedom Ride, there was an incident in 1964 where two young kids in Walgett, 9 and 10 years old, were jailed for stealing a couple of toys from the local church hall. Right? And this caused an outcry. Right? And the trade unions, the Builders Labourers Federation, actually organised a delegation of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal members and Waterside Workers Federation delegation that flew to Walgett, that observed the conditions and held a meeting where 100 local Aboriginal people came, and they formed a local branch of the Aborigines Protection Association in Walgett, right? The Aborigines Progressive Association, in Walgett. And this was just before the Freedom Ride was coming into Walgett. So you could see, as Hall said, there was already this movement, there was already this momentum. They'd formed an Aborigines Progressive Association there in Walgett. The mothers of these two boys came to Sydney. They were hosted at the Labor Council here in Sydney. The Labor Council paid for the lawyer to actually go to court and make representations that these kids shouldn't actually go into the care of the state. They should be able to stay with their family. There was also union delegations that actually went up to confront the segregation just after the Freedom Ride came into town. So the Freedom Ride came in, they had actions against the RSL, the Freedom Ride left. Student Action for Aborigines kept sending people up to Walgett to work with the local community. Local unions in Sydney also sent people up to work with the local community. And the main black leaders in Walgett were actually all shearers. They were members of the Australian Workers' Union. They were organised. They had some respect in the town as workers, and they had that sort of strength. And there was an attempt to break the colour bar where Harry Hall, who was one of the leading men up there, Ted Fields, there was a number of people and their families. They said, we're not going to allow this anymore. We've got to sit in one little section of the cinema. We're going to go in and demand that we're all allowed in, right? And they were arrested by police. They sent for backup, and there was a delegation of 20 Aboriginal trade unionists from Sydney who actually went up there later in 1965 to actually back up the local people to say desegregate what's actually going on in the cinema. So I did just want to share some of those stories. I mean, there's plenty of these stories from the time. This is the kind of campaigning that was going on. People were saying, as workers, it is not in our interests to accept racism. It is in our interest to reject racism and to fight for self-determination and land rights for Aboriginal people. And there were demands for land rights here in New South Wales before the Gurindji campaign. There's a mass meeting in the Labor Council of 600 trade unionists in 1963 passed a resolution for abolition of the Aborigines Protection Act and for land rights for the communities on the reserves, including at Cummeragunja. So they started to, sort of introduce these demands as well. And I just thought it's important to tell some of that stories and tell some of that history, because it's important that we understand that as a class, if we organise, we have power. We have nothing to gain from racism. We have everything to gain from fighting it. And people know maybe the stories about the Builders Labourers Federation and what they went on to do in the 1970s, with the fantastic stories about the green bans, where they put bans on to save parkland and heritage buildings. Well, the precursor to that was actually understanding we're against the system here in Australia and the racist divisions that it actually tries to enforce on us. And the being the development of an anti-racist, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist consciousness within the working class movement was very, very important for building the power of that movement to be able to launch huge strike waves at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Massive strike waves that massively increased the share that was going to wages instead of profits in the Australian economy by people, actually workers, refusing to work, demanding better pay, demanding better conditions. A crucial part of that was being anti-racist and understanding that our bosses are going to try to divide us, but we're stronger if we stand together. And I think that our unions are weaker today, but it's our responsibility to rebuild them. The struggle's not as organised today as it was. We don't have these formal organisations like they had, the Aboriginal Fellowship and everything, but we need to rebuild them. You know, if you actually have formal organisation, you build class power, you can fight and you can win. And everything we've heard from Paul, we know those struggles are just as urgent now as they were in 1965. So I might just leave it there.